This was my most intense labor compared to both my daughter's births. However, it was also my most empowering birth. I felt the most in control during this labor compared to my first two, and I felt the most in tune and confident in my body during this birth than I'd ever felt before. So I'm going to walk you through my labor and birth experience step by step with my third child, my son, and give you some tips along the way on how you can labor smarter, not harder, no matter if you are giving birth in a hospital or at home, and encourage you that you are built to birth. I'm Bridget. I'm a mama to 3, as well as a doula and a childbirth educator. If you are looking for empowering education for your pregnancy, your birth, and your postpartum period, make sure you subscribe to this channel and then hit the bell. So for just a tiny backstory, I had my first daughter in the hospital, my second daughter at home, and I just gave birth to my third, again at home, but this time in a birthing tub. A big difference that I experienced in this labor was back labor. Back labor is when your contractions are primarily felt in the low back instead of in the front of your body, in your belly. Towards the end of my pregnancy, I could tell that my baby was a little bit more OP or sunny side up, where the back of his head was more towards my back than to the front of my body. And I was doing the daily movements, exercising regularly, forward leaning as much as I could, and seeing a chiropractor as well, doing all the things to help my body be balanced to allow baby to get into whatever position was going to be most optimal for them to be born. This time around, baby chose to be more occiput posterior, and that's okay. So I was 39 weeks and 2 days pregnant, and for the last couple of weeks beforehand, I had been having contractions almost every day. Nothing intense, just noticeable. But that day, Sunday, November 26th, I really didn't feel anything out of the ordinary. However, I did have the tiniest bit of my mucus plug come out in the morning. It was just a bit of discharge, lightly tinged pink, so I really didn't think too much about it. You can lose your mucus plug and have several days before labor starts. So we went about our normal day. We went to church, we took a walk in the afternoon, we watched a Christmas movie with the girls, and I was having the occasional contraction, but nothing that I hadn't been feeling the weeks before. And that's my first bit of advice for expecting parents, is to not read into labor symptoms too much. Lots of times moms are discouraged that they're not having labor symptoms before labor begins, or they are hyper alert about every little change and sensation. And in my experience, this sort of just drives them crazy. You can have all the labor symptoms and true labor won't start for days or even weeks, or you can have no labor signs and go into labor that day. So that night on Sunday, my husband and I put our girls to bed around 7 p.m. While we were doing our bedtime routine with the girls, I was definitely feeling achiness in my low back, sort of like those period low back aches. And then around 8 p.m. was when I started having contractions, but they were very mild. I could easily distract myself from them. I was actually watching Lord of the Rings, which was the perfect distraction. And at this point, I was already feeling them in my low back. But that's actually really common early on in labor if baby is still high in the pelvis and they're having to move around the sacrum, which is the big bone at the top and back of the pelvis. In the Built to Birth course, I teach you all about the pelvis and the levels of the pelvis and how different sensations in the body give you insight into where baby might be so that you can choose movements that help open up that part of the pelvis. That course is linked down below for you. So early on in the evening, I did some stretches to release my low back muscles and my front hips. I did a forward leaning inversion through one contraction to, again, just optimize my body's balance and alignment. I had been doing my prenatal fitness program up until birth, so that really helped with my body balance and pelvic mobility and openness already, and that program is also linked down below for you. I was doing a hands and knees position draped over pillows for a good chunk of this time, but this was a position that I often got in if we were watching something anyways. So then around 8:30, I finally was like, okay, I'm pretty sure that this is early labor. I was also having lots of loose stools, which is another sign of early labor, and it's because prostaglandins are released in the body to help soften, thin, and open the cervix, and prostaglandins also make you poop a lot, which is why, along with the added pressure of baby on the bowels, women go poop a lot more in labor. This is so normal, so don't be worried about pooping at any point during the birthing process. So between 8:30 and 9 p.m., I texted my birth team, which was my sister and my midwife, and I just let them know that I was having contractions, but I would check back in with them in an hour or so if it was real labor and when I needed them to come. I wasn't timing my surges yet because I felt it was still early and I didn't need to. The longer you can wait to get into the headspace for labor and just keep doing life as normal, the shorter labor will feel. So then for the next hour or so, I labored on my bed on all fours, kneeling over the side of my bed, sitting on my birth ball, and standing and swaying as I needed to. So then by about 10 p.m., my husband was like, "You need to call Grace, our midwife." And I have a tendency to want to wait. And with my second daughter, I waited a little longer than I needed to, and our midwives almost missed the birth. So because my husband could sense the shift in my behavior and that this was the real deal, he was like, "It's time to call them to come." And I was talking less. I was really focusing on breathing through my surges. I had to move during my surges. I couldn't sit still. And my contractions were about 3 minutes apart, lasting about 1 minute. And I talk about this in the Built to Birth course too, but better than the timing of contractions, how mama is behaving during and then between her surges usually provides a better idea of where she is in labor. For example, in my first labor, my surges started out about 3 minutes apart, but I was not anywhere close to active labor. This time, when my surges got to be about 3 minutes apart, I was probably getting into active labor if I wasn't already. Partners, you can usually see this shift in mama as her labor progresses. So as my surges intensified and they became more frequent, I instinctively knew I had to move my body. I didn't know exactly where my baby was in my pelvis. I didn't know how dilated I was, but I knew intuitively that I had to move simply by tuning into what my body was telling me. This was definitely my most active labor, and despite having back labor and being pretty confident that he was OP, my labor was quite fast and I didn't have any stalls, and I really do attribute that to moving as much as I did. Movement brings improvement, and when mama moves, baby moves. My favorite moves as I progressed into active labor were standing and really exaggerating my swaying movements from side to side, and squatting where I would rotate my knees in and out. And these movements told me that my baby was probably in the middle of my pelvis, and I was instinctively trying to open that part of my pelvis by creating asymmetry. In the Built to Birth course, I teach you several different positions and movements that open up each level of the pelvis, from the inlet at the top to the mid-pelvis in the middle, and then the outlet at the bottom of the pelvis. However, when you are in a safe, uninterrupted, free, and trustworthy environment, you will be able to instinctively move in such a way that encourages labor progress, even if you don't know why you're moving the way that you are. Learning to trust your intuition is some of the most important work that you can do beforehand to support labor. So by now my midwives had arrived. It was just before 11 p.m. And for most home births, you're going to have two midwives. You're going to have your primary one that you've seen throughout your whole pregnancy and is going to be providing you care during labor, and then one that you've met beforehand but hasn't been providing the bulk of your care, who is there more for support and, if necessary, to provide medical attention to baby after birth. And this is just one of the ways that your care team is making sure that they are providing the safest and most complete care for you and your baby at home. So for the next hour, I spent the most of my time on my birth ball, swaying with my husband, using the rebozo, and then making sure I was walking around between contractions while my birth team was filling up my birth tub. I spent some time laboring on the toilet as well, and the toilet is called the dilation station because it's where your pelvic floor is used to relaxing, which actually allows baby to move down more and open up the cervix. So while I was sitting on the toilet, I had a lot of bloody show come out, which is blood-tinged mucus that you lose throughout labor that indicates that the cervix is opening and thinning. So when you see bloody show, that should encourage you because it means that labor is moving along. So at midnight, I got into the tub and my surges slowed down a little bit. And a lot of times medical practitioners want to push progress. And if there's a slow in labor, there's an impatient desire to intervene and keep things moving along. But when I mentioned that my surges had slowed being in the tub, Grace, my midwife, responded so positively and was like, "Oh good, you get a little break." And it just reminded me of how important it is to have medical practitioners and other birth support members providers who trust birth, who trust you as the mama, and who understand that normal and natural birth works best when it's allowed to unfold in its own timing and way, because labor progress isn't always linear. And I really was so grateful for the rest and relief of the water and the slowed contractions. Hydrotherapy is called the Midwife's epidural because of how effective it is at providing relief. So, if you're planning your labor, I really recommend using the water as a comfort measure, either using a shower or a tub. In the tub, I spent a lot of time on all fours or with my belly down in the water. My midwife was listening to baby with the Doppler about every 30 minutes and was able to just work around whatever position that I was in, which was something that I was really grateful for. And this is another piece of advice for you. Intermittent monitoring leads to fewer interventions compared to continuous fetal monitoring. So unless you are being induced or have an epidural, intermittent fetal monitoring is a really good option to avoid unnecessary or unwanted interventions. And it allows you to labor more freely and help you tap into what your baby and body need from you during labor. I talk all about intermittent versus continuous monitoring in the Built to Birth course. So then around 12:30, my surges were probably around 2 minutes apart, and this was when my water released. I was in the tub, but I could feel fluid coming out and I wasn't peeing. And then after my water release was when my contractions really started picking up and intensifying, which is common because that cushion of fluid that's between baby's head and the cervix goes away. The position that made me most comfortable at this point was hands and knees, and then during the surges I would push my bottom backward, and again, this was just another instinctual movement, one that helped open the bottom of my pelvis by spreading the sit bones apart, and with my arms in front of me, like overhead, that was actually pulling my tailbone away from the bottom of the pelvis, again making more space in the bottom. I wasn't consciously thinking, oh, I need to do this movement. It's just what my body knew it needed to do to make the most room for my baby. Again, this is all information you learn in my Built to Birth course, so that if labor does become challenging, maybe there's a stall, you can implement certain positions that create more space in the pelvis to help baby navigate the space that they're in. Now, because I was having back labor, Grace and James started to apply some counter pressure on my low back, and that helped a lot. But really just staying as calm and relaxed as possible and continuing to breathe through your surges and allow yourself to go as limp as possible is what really helped me be able to cope and find comfort with the intense sensations of the back labor. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, I was most empowered and in tune with myself during this labor, and this led me to actually reach up and feel for my baby's head during labor by basically doing my own very gentle vaginal exam. Mama, it is your body and baby, and there should be nothing that stands in the way of you doing this for yourself. So I just placed my fingers into my birth canal and I felt the top of my baby's head, and that was about a finger length into my vagina, and that was just so encouraging to me. That was around 1:50 a.m. and I was feeling a ton of pressure in my butt at this point, which is common as baby descends further down, but I felt it so much more in this labor than I had in my first two. But 5 minutes later, I started feeling the fetal ejection reflex, which is when your body just involuntarily pushes because baby gets low enough in your pelvis and in your pelvic floor tissues that your body just automatically wants to eject them from your body. Now, when I initially started feeling the fetal ejection reflex, I was still just breathing through my contractions, but my uterus was pushing my baby out. And then the sensation became super strong and I started actively pushing alongside that sensation. I could feel my baby's head moving down the birth canal, and I had mixed feelings of wanting to push as hard as I could to make him be born faster, and then trying to slow things down to make birth more relaxing and help my perineal tissues expand slowly to avoid tearing. He ended up being born very fast in just 7 minutes, and I didn't tear this birth. I had a small abrasion which didn't require any stitches, and with my first two I didn't have any significant tearing either, and I think there are two big contributing factors. Number one, I listened to my body's urges to push. I never let a practitioner lead my pushing, and two, because I didn't give birth on my back, which which increases the chances of more severe perineal trauma during birth. I gave birth in an upright lunge position, and then my husband was able to catch our baby, and we brought him to my chest, and we finally found out that we had a son because we didn't know throughout our whole pregnancy. He was born at 2:02 a.m., and it was such a sweet and powerful moment being able to catch him ourselves and experience those first few minutes with no one intervening. It was just our family together. Now, in both of my other births, I got a shot of Pitocin to prevent postpartum blood loss because I had low platelets in my pregnancy. However, this time in pregnancy, I was really proactive about taking the right herbs and supplements and diet to support stronger blood, and between myself and my midwife, we were confident that I wouldn't need it. And after this birth, I didn't need a shot of Pitocin, so that was really nice. I stayed in the tub for a while after birth, waiting for my placenta to be born, but I wanted to get in bed, so I just walked over to my bed, and at 2:30 a.m. my placenta was born. My son was still attached to the placenta because his umbilical cord hadn't yet turned white, which meant that he was still getting blood from the placenta. In the hospital setting, the norm is to cut the umbilical cord very early, within the first 1 to 3 minutes after birth. Ideally, you want to wait as long as it takes for it to turn white and stop pulsating so that your baby gets all that oxygen and blood from their placenta into their body. We ended up waiting an hour to cut his cord. And now one of my favorite things about home birth is being able to snuggle in your own bed after giving birth, and that's just what we did. And then in the morning, our girls met their baby brother for the first time, and it was so sweet and precious watching them meet and hold him for the very first time. I love birth, and I've seen and experienced how birth is so powerful and transformative, whether it's your first time giving birth or your third or your fifth. And truly, education brings so much confidence and trust into the birthing journey. If you're not yet totally confident when it comes to birth, check out my free birth course down below and my full online course that I created to help parents feel super empowered about all their options and decisions when it comes to birth. Thanks so much for listening to my birth story. I'll see you next time.